nothing about a policy to include air conditioning in public buildings. It's just not enough. But it's tick the box on building efficiency measures, right? So we're going to turn the world green. We're going to turn that around, and we're going to, yes, okay, so I'm just going to, so where we expect growth to be over the next few decades, 66% of those countries lack mandatory energy codes, meaning what we build today, we know, is nowhere near the levels of ambition we need to curb emissions, and it's definitely not what we need to be building for the future. And so we're building buildings that we're going to have to renovate, and we're doing that knowingly, like we know we're doing that, which is just crazy. 80 countries have adopted. That's changed since yesterday, but there are countries that have energy codes, but we need to be putting the pressure on and raising that level of ambition. And I'll come on to Ambition Loop in a second. First, please. Yeah. Okay, so can you click a couple of times, actually, and I'll just talk through this slide. So one more. Thank you. So the Advancing Net Zero program from the World Green Building Council created a vision which is quickly becoming an imperative for the global building and construction sector. And it involves no less than completely transforming the way that we design and build and construct and use and deconstruct our buildings. And we called it the whole life carbon vision, and it encompasses both the concepts of operational carbon and embodied carbon, meaning that we cannot solve the operational carbon without the embodied carbon consideration. You know, we can't specify certain materials without considering how that affects the performance of the building and vice versa. And I won't go through these in detail. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the sort of reduce concepts. You know, we need to be reducing energy consumption from an operational point of view, meeting that demand with renewable energy, and then offsetting any residual emissions that are left. Same goes for embodied carbon, reducing our embodied carbon by, first of all, preventing it where we can by choosing to renovate existing buildings instead of building new. So building less is like principle one. And then when we do build, optimizing those designs to make sure that they are, they really consider the opportunities to reduce embodied carbon through design measures, through clean construction, and then thinking about modular design, for example, optimizing those choices and then planning for the future, thinking about how a building could be adapted for different uses and how it could be demolished at the end of its useful life and then help towards a circular economy. And then, as we know, to achieve a net zero balance of embodied carbon is impossible without offsets. And World GBC's position is that highly credible, highly verified and high quality offsets are a necessary part of the transition to net zero. So yeah, let's keep going. So I think twice more. Sorry, I don't have a clicker, so it's a bit tricky. Thanks. Kirsty's going to drive the slides. Yeah, because she knows, because she did. Okay. Oh, thank you. Amazing. Thank you very much. You're off the hook. Okay, so we have a kind of two-track approach to achieving this vision. First of all, our mainstream vision for decarbonization of the built environment is that by 2050, all buildings, new and existing, are net zero operational carbon and net zero whole life carbon, so operational and embodied together. And that from 2030, new buildings should be net zero operational carbon, and we should be achieving at least a 40% reduction in embodied carbon. And 2030 in building terms is just around the corner. There are buildings under design now that will be finished around or even past 2030. So these are the standards that are expected to be achieved by buildings you're designing today. So, as I said, complete transformation of the way we've been doing business for decades. So in order to understand what that looks like and what that means, we introduced the leadership track of the Net Zero Carbon Buildings Commitment, which asks businesses to achieve the 2050 goals 20 years earlier. And we, of course, have DAR Group has signed up to the commitment, and JLL, and we were talking about that on this morning's panel. And what that helps us understand is asking the questions about how to get your own assets to net zero and how you can help your clients do that or your supply chain do that, how you can help influence the reduction of emissions across the full value chain. And that tells us so much about the gaps in terms of delivery, the tools we need, the data we need, the policies we need to help us achieve those 2050 goals, the business approaches, the new models. So we invite everyone to sign up and consider signing up to the Net Zero Carbon Buildings commitment and join DAR and the likes of Tron, JLL and others in really helping to advance the sector. Oh, great. Okay, thank you. So we have 136 businesses and organizations, 29 cities, and 6 states and regions signed up to the commitment. The cities and states and regions focus on operational carbon through the Net Zero Carbon Buildings Accelerator from C40, now Accelerator was Declaration, and the Clean Construction Accelerator, which addresses emissions from construction. Thank you. And one of the examples from within Africa that we have signed up to the commitment earlier this year, our first commitment signatory from Africa. This is ALP North, Africa Logistics Properties. And this is one of their projects which actually achieved EDGE certification a few years ago in 2018. And they've adopted the commitment to address the emissions from what are essentially their logistics and warehouses facilities, knowing that they need to build better. And they're already starting to deliver projects of this scale and size highly efficiently and at I wouldn't say negligible, but at not as high as cost as they expected to have to do to delivering in Kenya. And so this really helps from a proving the possible perspective that we're here and able to demonstrate that there are already projects in Africa striving and achieving these high levels of performance. Now, this is important because of a concept that we refer to as the ambition loop. And the Marrakesh partners and the high-level champions refer to this a lot, and they recently published a breakthrough agenda which sets out the types of levers and actions that need to be taken by different stakeholders in order to help propel us forward, because we're simply running out of time. And the idea of this is that businesses start by thinking about what sorts of targets you can set, and then thinking about what actions are necessary to work towards those targets. And then that starts to create, you start talking about it, which creates confidence in cities to start thinking about their own net zero goals and setting roadmaps. That creates confidence in investors to start investing in the transition to a net zero economy, which then helps us set more specific regulations and policies for mainstream adoption. And we call this the ambition loop. And what Nigel Topping was telling us recently is that the ambition loop is happening, but it needs to be tightened and it needs to happen faster. So we are seeing brilliant examples of front-runner action, leaders in the race to zero, taking this action on. And we're seeing cities take notice and governments take notice and the policy starts coming in, but it's painfully slow. So the more people that are involved in this loop, the better and the faster we can help it move. The point here is that we cannot get away with saying we need to wait for regulation, because regulators are waiting for you guys, right? So we all have to be moving together and taking those steps that complement each other at the same time. Thanks. We have one more, sorry. We have a report that we publish at World Green Building Council called the Advancing Net Zero Status Report. And it helps us tell the stories of action, because we get like half a page in World GBC's annual report and it's just not enough. So we published our own report, and it tells stories of the Green Building Councils and the commitment signatories and the members across the world that are genuinely taking action, and it helps us track market trends and demonstrate what's happening and what's changing. And the front cover this year was, of course, the Majid Al Futtaim project from the UAE, which just achieved net zero certification. Thank you. Also, one more. Also within the report is this interactive graphic, which helps you understand, no matter what sort of business you are, that there is a target and an initiative that you can sign up to help demonstrate your ambition. So, this doesn't read very well, sorry, didn't think this through. So basically, no matter what type of business you are eligible and should consider signing up to, as a minimum, science-based targets by 2050, even better, the climate pledge by 2040, and even better, the net zero carbon buildings commitment by 2030. And all of those initiatives complement each other. Because what we're finding from the commitment signatories is that once you set that target, it actually can be achievable today a lot sooner than we're seeing. And in fact, in addition to an annual report, we also now produce monthly news updates about how our commitment signatories are doing towards their action, because otherwise these reports would be enormous every year. And so we're now telling those stories every month because that's how fast the pace of change is. Thank you. We've also published last year at last year's COP a report called Beyond the Business Case. And in this session this morning, we were being asked about the business case. It happens all the time. And this is why we wrote this report. And one of the things that we addressed in the report is that the business case is strengthening. There's lots of reasons from an ESG perspective, from a reputational risk perspective, why the business case is strengthening. But what we concluded is that you simply can't afford not to invest in a more sustainable built environment when you also consider a broader value proposition that considers the social value case as well, which is also increasing. There's expectations from your tenants, from your employees. There's the benefits to occupants for occupying more sustainable spaces and from the people who are buying the buildings that you're creating. So we simply cannot achieve the race to zero, win the race to zero without addressing emissions from the built environment. And so winning the race means net zero buildings, it means net zero infrastructure, and it means net zero cities. And so really, again, grateful to those like DAR Group who are taking that ambition and that leadership and proving that it can be done. So thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. Does anyone have any question for Victoria before we start our panel? Okay, very insightful talk. Thank you. So now we'll start with the panel, starting off with Kathy Wardo. Cassie is Principal and Director of Sustainability at Perkins & Will. Kathy plays an instrumental role in the development of high-performance green building projects. She's currently advising on 3 large-scale projects that are pursuing net zero operational carbon in their design. She leads a sustainable design team and energy advisors that do offer clients a range of sustainability services. She's well versed in sustainability issues that range from resilient design, energy and carbon performance of buildings, to health and well-being of building occupants. She co-chairs Perkins & Will Living Design Initiative, and we're happy also to have her as DAR Group Chair of the Sustainability Council. Kathy. Next is Adam. Adam is Director in Curry & Brown's Advisory Services. For nearly 20 years, he has worked with several clients and policymakers to develop a robust business case for decarbonization of the built environment. He's currently working with the UK government on the development of building standards and on the introduction of new standards for fossil fuel-free development. In parallel, he's advising property owners on the decarbonizations of their existing estates. He's currently developing strategies for over 80 buildings that range from 200 to 130,000 square meter and that are from 8 to 250 years old. He has advised a wide range of bodies on building standards, policies, including UK Climate Change Committee, Dubai Municipality, and the Greater London Authority. Welcome, Adam. Next, we have Louise. So Louise Collins leads both the project and development services business in the UAE and the engineering and energy business across the Middle East for JLL. With over 22 years of experience in the construction industry in Europe and GCC, Louise has extensive design management and project delivery experience across various industry sectors, including sustainability projects. Having spent most of her career in engineering consultancy, she's passionate about designing and delivering buildings that operate sustainably with low energy and low water use. Louise is a strong advocate for women in the industry and often works with schools and organizations to raise awareness about female representation. Welcome, Louise. And last but not least is Dina. Dina is the ESG partner and impact center lead with Strategy End, Energy Utilities and Resource Practices in the Middle East. She's also leading the development of the PwC Middle East ESG Impact Center, and her project experience includes ESG, climate risk mitigation, global sustainability, circular economy, risk management, and mitigation plan. Welcome, Dina. And we do have online Noah. Noah is the co-leader of Integrals Group Design Analytic Practice an intersectional collection of building engineers, data scientists, bioclimatic design specialists, energy and carbon experts. Noah heads the carbon and economic strategy that does help clients find actionable, reliable, and affordable ways to decarbonize their existing assets or build new zero carbon developments. Noah specializes in economic strategy, renewable financing, whole life carbon, and he was elected for 2020 Class of 40 Under 40 Awards winner. Welcome, Noah. So I think you guys can turn on those. Do they work? Just to make sure that they do before we start. Excellent. Wow. I wish all the panels were like this. So we'll start with the general question where I'd like really to hear each and everyone's opinion about like what needs, we know, well, Victoria has mentioned that we are definitely in a climate crisis and it seems that we are behind. So what is the set of things or the set of actions that you would think of to start opening our discussion that would help us really fight climate change as soon as possible and as efficient as possible? Kathy?
Thanks very much, Balsam, for inviting myself to join the panel this afternoon. I think there's been a lot of negative press around that we're not meeting our 1.5 degree targets, but I don't think we have the luxury to focus on the negative. I think I am an optimist, and I think we are this whole panel is in the business of offering our clients design solutions. We're innovators, and we have the technology and the solutions available to us today. It's actually more about changing behavior and looking towards how we implement those solutions for our clients in the built environment. The buildings, like Victoria said, are responsible for 40% of our emissions. And so what are the tools, solutions that we have at our fingertips today to help us reduce those emissions? So I'm positive that we can do it. Now it's about behavior change.
Adam?
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. From my perspective, given the urgency of the need to take action, I think a very quick and impactful change we could all make is in the way that we manage our buildings. The facilities management sector is rarely represented at conferences like this, but actually they play an absolutely crucial role in getting the best out of the buildings. And the wonderful work that someone like Kathy would do in designing a sustainable building is thrown away if that building is then not operated in line with the design intent. And there's so many instances where buildings are left to their own devices, which typically means using much more energy than they need to. I'm working currently on a project for a major hospital in London where they have very, very little understanding of where their energy is being used in the building. And until they understand that, they can't take any action to reduce it. And once they do understand it, there are probably 20 things they could do within a fortnight that will bring their energy bills down. So those are some really quick things that can be done, in addition to obviously addressing zero carbon in the new build environment. But from where I see in London, our biggest focus is always on the existing stock, and it's something that often gets overlooked and where there are really quick and valuable benefits to be gained at a cost saving.
I really like Kathy's optimism, but elephant in the room, we're way behind. We're using up more carbon now, 5% more than we were 2 years ago when we initially committed. We're also building 5 billion square meters of real estate every week in the world. So trying to offset while still building is a huge issue. I think for me, I heard a lady from Gensler this morning, and she said, we go into our buildings expecting them to accommodate us. And there needs to be a change in mindset where we collaborate with buildings, where we go in and we put on a jacket. We don't need the air conditioning on high. We can open a window. We don't need our hot water on all of the time. I think it's optimization by habit, as well as obviously there's a lot of technology and IoT that we can use that we build into our big buildings. I think it also really comes down to individuals and how we respect our usage and how we respect our buildings and our environment and how we can use them a lot better. And that's obviously on existing buildings. We're now building, Victoria touched on it, we're building buildings now that will be standing in 2050 and will have to be net zero. So being cognizant of that and understanding what technology will come online and how to optimize those buildings now is really important. We're looking at projects, giga projects in Saudi Arabia right now, and they're not going to be finished for 5 years. And we're designing them on paper now. So it really needs to be a dynamic design and installation process as well as we go along this journey.
Hi, and thank you very much for having me as well. And I mean, I'm in awe of the panelists. I'm in awe of Victoria and everything that you do. I agree with the panelists. I mean, the thing that I see most is we have to, first of all, collaborate, exchange knowledge. Yes, we are running out of time, and yes, that part of it is we know it's coming. But what we're also seeing is linking the human element to the built environment, and I think you mentioned it quite well, is we need to be collaborating with the building. And the reason for that is because we spend most of our time in buildings. It's our well-being that's at risk here. So when we start explaining it and communicating it to the person down the street, we have to say that you are going to be impacted. It's not the person who is, in a developing country or even down the street. We have the mentality sometimes that it's only us. And so linking it to our well-being, linking it to our community, also linking climate change to, I'm going to sound cliche, the greater good. Yes, that's important, but I don't think we're doing that enough. And the reason for that is there's this disconnect sometimes between scientists, people who are, smart, way smarter than me, and between the person who's trying to just go and live in a small apartment and go to their work and come back from work. And I think that link, make it more human, maybe that's something that we need to work towards.
Great, thank you. I want to go back to Kathy and the point that you've mentioned about the solutions that you have. So here you're representing one of the biggest architecture firms in the world. And as architects, what are the solutions that you're providing for your clients to get to net zero and sometimes even to net positive? What can you tell us here?
Is it on now? Okay. It's a great question about, what are we doing? How are we helping our clients? And on Earth Day last year, we launched a new initiative, and what we're offering every client a carbon forecast. So we want to educate our clients about what is the roadmap for each new project for reducing carbon from a whole life carbon emission standpoint. So that's not only addressing the operational side of the carbon pie, but also the embodied side, which Victoria was talking about. And I think when we look at operational carbon, I think that's kind of second nature to what we've been doing for a very long time at Perkins & Will. We know that first and foremost, we need to take a passive design approach. So understanding how we orient a building on the site, looking at natural solar conditions, natural ventilation, it's good best practice. The next thing we look to do is actually take an envelope first approach. So how do we actually reduce the demand for energy within the building? And then how do we then use energy really efficiently in terms of lighting, HVAC, heating and cooling systems? So we're reducing that load as much as possible. And then we're looking to use renewables and then last but not least, the last measure is really to offset. Now, as we design better performing buildings, we know that the embodied carbon piece of the whole life carbon becomes a much bigger piece of that puzzle to solve. And I think that's what we're trying to solve today is really, what is the information that we need to get to our designers? How do we inform the supply chain? How do we update our project specifications so that we actually show to the marketplace a demand for low carbon products like low carbon concrete, low carbon insulation, mass timber, so that we can actually show the marketplace that there is demand for these new, not necessarily new products, but there's a demand for producing building materials in a better and more sustainable way. So just a few things there that we're looking at.
And also on that note, I know you've been working on a specific tool for this. So did you want to tell us more about it?
Sure.
And maybe we could share that slide that you have with you.
So really excited to share some news. So we have a team out of Perkins & Will, and we've been pleased to partner with buildingtransparency.org and Sea Change Labs. Coming up on about a year ago, we received a clean innovation grant from the government of British Columbia in Canada to develop what we've called is the Tally Climate Action Tool, so TallyCat. And what we saw as a need was that in the BIM model, in a Revit model, our design teams, our architects were not able to make informed decisions about different material assemblies. So what this new tool will do in partnership with Building Transparency is that it brings environmental product declarations, EPDs, from a tool called the Environmental Carbon Calculator, EC3 tool, directly into the Revit model, right into your BIM model. What that empowers every architect to do is actually make an informed decision about assembly choices. So last week at Green Build, we launched together the beta version. If you take a screenshot of the QR code, you can check it out. It's in beta version, and we will be working with our partners to kind of launch the full version in spring of 2023. Once we're kind of working out the kinks, but it's something where we feel we can kind of leverage all of this information and then scale it in the delivery of our projects for clients.
And this will be really extensively useful.
Yeah, it's beta version right now, and then full release in the spring.
Great, excellent. Louise, so you're coming from the real estate sector. And I know that you're not confident that any sector is really on track for the targets of 2030 and then 2050. But within the real estate, what do you think still needs to be done to get to our targets? And also my question goes to single residential applications, and also because you've mentioned maybe NEOM or Saudi Arabia in general, the climate, let's say, restrictions. And then a third part of the question, and I can break it back down, is the idea of really high-end residential villa. How sustainable is it to be, or let's say how useful the work that is being done in terms of the high-end residential villa, how does it align with our sustainability targets, and what are the challenges there? A lot of questions, yeah.
I have your first question. I'm just kidding. So 80% of the world building stock that is in cities right now will still be around in 2050. So a lot of JLL's global work is focused on the refurbishments. In the UAE, in Dubai right now, they've just introduced, they've introduced in April of this year a optimization management building code, which means we have to reduce our operations by 30% by 2030. So we're really working with companies there's a lot of over design. There's a lot of buildings that were built too quick. There's buildings that are being misused, and it's about bringing all those things together and focusing on what we can do with that existing asset portfolio. So we're working with a lot of clients on that, and we're really, when we work on it, we're really focusing on return on investment. We hear a lot about finance over the last couple of days, and we're hearing a lot about we need legislation. But for me, the money will release the action. So we're going into clients and saying, if you do A, B, and C, and we'll work out where the money comes from, if that's internal or external later. But if you do the following actions, in 4 years, you will have your money back. And in 6 years on from that, these are your savings. And this is where you'll be on track for net zero or whatever their targets are, short and long term. From a new development perspective, we're doing a similar study. Clients aren't saying they want to target net zero, but they are looking at alternatives, and we're bringing alternatives to the table. Okay, you didn't want a VRV system within your building, but we're going to give you that option. We're going to give you the details of what that would look like, what that efficiency would be, and how much that will cost you and how much that will save you. So presenting it without being asked with a return on investment to kind of bring clients in across the line, that's kind of where we're going for at the moment. Your second question with regard to residential is a really good question. Residences are 21% of our operational greenhouse emissions right now. So without legislation, if you look at single house users, it will really come down to individuals. We know there's parts of the world and cities that do have legislation, and very robust ones in some of the bigger cities like Seattle and Singapore. But in developing countries or countries in the Middle East right now, apart from the actual building code, which is probably at the lower end of efficiency, it will come down to individual usage. And your last part of the question was high-end residential. I don't think carbon discriminates between low-end and high-end. It's about good building. It's about optimization, selecting the right materials. And actually, high-end is where people have the money potentially to pay for the better performing materials. So the reality is they should be better performing.
Great.
Right.
You've mentioned cost, so Louise has mentioned cost, Adam, and I do know that that's your area of expertise as well as Dina. So I'll start with Adam, and then I'll move down to you, Dina. So we always get asked that why is a net zero project so expensive? I don't want to do net zero, or I don't want to do a sustainable project because I know it's expensive. So how do the numbers add up? Like, how does sustainable net zero projects make a valid business case?
Okay. Yeah, it's a very good question, and it's one that we also get asked a lot as well. And it's part of the reason why, from a background in environmental consultancy, I went to join Curry and Brown about 15 years ago to be able to answer that question: what does it cost, and is it good value for money? And the answer has changed a lot over that 15 years because technologies and prices have changed massively. And it's interesting to reflect that the cost of photovoltaics has dropped by over 85% in the last decade. So things that we would have said, steer clear of that, that's going to be really expensive, is now get as much of that as you possibly can into your building, because it's a really good way of reducing your running costs and saving carbon. So things change, and at the moment I think we're in a very good position in that there's an incredibly strong financial case for building to net zero, leaving aside all of the other excellent reasons that Victoria outlined on that pie chart previously. So just picking on the financial payback aspect. The first aspect that I would say is that actually the best return on investment you get is not through a physical asset or a technology. It's actually through taking the time to understand your building, whether that's a new building or an existing building, and then investing in the right controls for that building. So they can be complicated controls if necessary, but ideally simple controls, but the right controls proportionate to that building. And most importantly, when you're designing a new building, you take the time to understand its energy use in detail based on all the energy rather than just a standardized set. So in the UK, and I think in other countries, certainly across Europe, we have a very specific way of assessing compliance with building codes. That compliance bears absolutely no resemblance to how the building will perform in practice. So what you need to be able to do is take that assessment and actually overlay on that what you're actually intending to do with the building, who's going to be using it for how long, and in what other technologies may they be bringing to the building. Otherwise, any payback calculation is completely undermined, because actually you may be assuming that you'll be saving 10% of your energy, but if you're actually only modeling 50% of your energy, then actually you're only saving 5% of your energy. So it's important that you understand and you get that level of detail. Moving on from that, though, the next sort of things that we would say is actually there's a huge amount you can get through really good design. We did some work looking at tall buildings in London a few years ago, where we modeled a whole range of building orientations and massing and balcony positioning, whether it was single aspect, dual aspect rooms, and we found that actually you could get 30-40% reductions in energy cost and energy consumption purely through design measures, and actually often lower cost design measures because you're reducing your glazed area, positioning it in the right way to get good levels of daylight, but reducing the cost because the glass is more expensive than the solid walls. So there are things that you can do by just taking that time at the early design stage. And then as you move through the project, a key tool that we use is whole life performance evaluation. So that's like life cycle costing. You look at the capital cost, in-use cost, operational cost, maintenance, replacement, so you're designing for longevity, but you also then factor in external costs. So we put a price on carbon, we put a price on air quality, we put a price on well-being, and we factor these things into the overall benefits case. And by doing that, and as long as you're clear about how you've done that process, you can really make a very strong and compelling case. We often find, though, actually that our clients are not asking us for a minimum payback period. What they need to do is they've been told by their clients, by their tenants, or by the market that they need to be hitting these targets. They want to find out the best way and the most responsible way of doing that. But whether they do it or not is not up for discussion. It's about how they do it.
Great. Dina, so what do you think about this topic?
First of all, I totally agree. It's not about it's about the legacy and the longevity. And I'll just share a little story. Before I started with Strategy, and I was the director of sustainability for Expo 2020. And building a site such as this, I mean, we started from, let's say, clear, it was desert when I started. This site was not built for the 6 months of the event. It was built for the legacy. So looking at the entire life of those buildings gave us the opportunity to be more efficient and to actually look at the cost benefit of what we're doing. We had strict materials guidelines. And what happened when you have strict materials guidelines is your contractors and subcontractors start adhering because they want to be part of this great project. But in doing that, there's also a new market coming in. So the economic benefit of, for the UAE, for example, the indirect economic benefit and what happened to the green economy just by building a site twice the size of Monaco with 95% of the buildings being permanent and have a use going forward and building it efficiently created that indirect economic impact. So there's the direct economic impact, and trust me, when COVID hit, everyone wanted to reduce the budget. And the interesting thing is, no, but we want to keep the building sustainable because we know that we're going to have residents coming in that want that kind of development. So what ended up happening is we were the only budget that wasn't cut. And that allowed us to actually measure the direct economic impact and the indirect economic impact for the city of Dubai. And hence why COP28 is going to be held at Expo. That's my answer.
Thank you. Noah, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Perfect. So now my question goes to you. First of all, I've missed you from the introductory question, so I'll repeat that one. What are the set of actions that, from your perspective, we'll need to do to reach our targets? And then my second question is aligned with the topic of discussion. Like, what are the proposed solutions that would make carbon offsets, because we know that at the end of the day, we'll have to purchase offsets, more appealing from a financial perspective?
Absolutely. I just wanted to confirm you all can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, so glad to and honored to be on this panel. So thank you so much for including me. Yeah, for the opening question, there are so many great points there. So I'm just going to add ones that I don't think were mentioned as much, but I agree with what was said. I think the first one, big moves. People really need things to be able to latch onto. So I think it's important that we focus on giving people big wins, tangible wins, so that they can feel like that their actions are having a positive impact without watering down what those are. I think the other one, just to add on to, is we need to build a world now for a successful future. So a lot of talk has been given to, making sure the buildings support a decarbonized future now, because the buildings are going to last for 50 years. I think that's an extremely important perspective. And I also want to say it's our job to simplify everything so that people can act in a clear manner. So whether it's embodying carbon, whole life carbon, how the grid affects everything, price, giving clear direction to people so that if they are able to act in a certain way, that there's able to have a big outcome. It's sort of a team assignment for all of humanity to get this done. And so I think the motivational part is really important. And to all the points about how we're really behind our goals, we are. This is extremely urgent. But every action we don't take will make it even worse. So we have to keep focusing on doing everything we can. So that would be sort of my take on that. For the other question about carbon offsets, uh, the way I'd like to propose the thing is there's no such thing as other people's carbon. I think it's a really important perspective for us. So a carbon offset is this idea that uh, someone else's carbon or their carbon savings can help you. It's valuable to look at this holistically like that, but I think the primary goal should be to try to reduce the use and the reliance on other people's on this perspective of other people's carbon. So to that end, I think having a focus on tangible additionality, that a carbon offset would be something that was additionally done to additionally remove carbon rather than just relying on the actions that we assume are taken by others. And the reason I think that's important is otherwise it creates scarcity in the market. If there's only so much carbon saving being done, then as more and more people rely on it, there'll be less and less an ability to use it. And businesses really like stability. It helps with minimizing risk. It helps with planning. So I think to bring that all together, the way I usually like to look at it is it's all about the dollars spent now for carbon saved in the future. So whether you're evaluating whether you should use a more efficient mechanical system, more efficient envelope, whether you should install solar on your own building or whether you should look at solar somewhere else, I think looking at that holistic perspective will make carbon offsets fit into the picture in a more financially compelling manner. One common pitfall is in multifamily residential, there's usually not enough roof space for on-site renewables to help achieve a zero carbon building. So rather than give up, it's just this notion of how can you do things like community solar? How can you invest in solar and storage in other facilities where you partner and pool your resources together? I just think that mindset of carbon offset just being a scope increase where you're working with others rather than punting the problem to others would be my take.
Great, thank you. Kathy, so Noah has mentioned health and well-being also, in addition to all the talk that we're doing about decarbonization and emissions and so on. And we all know how Perkins & Will is engaged on the living design and does prioritize the health and well-being of the building occupants. So what's your drive and what's your take at this, and how can they complement each other?
Thanks, Balsam, for really highlighting the importance of health and well-being. I think it was Dina who mentioned. I think we spend 90% of our time indoors as human beings, and so when you just look around this conference room, by way of example, we need to think about the building materials that are in here: the carpet, the paint, the adhesives. They're all made of different substances, some natural, some not natural. And in many cases, the ingredients that make up our building materials actually have harmful effects on our human health. So about a decade ago, Perkins & Will launched something called the precautionary list, which identifies probably close now to about 20 different harmful substances that are commonly found in our building materials. This list is publicly available online on our transparency site. And what it does is it educates people about what are these harmful materials, from everything from bisphenol A to PVC, where they're found in common building materials in different spec divisions, the human health effects, also the environmental effects. And I think now is, as we try and prioritize carbon in our decision-making process, we can't forget about human health. So it's not an and or, it should be both and approach to evaluating the materials that we're using to construct our buildings. Actually in the spring, our material performance team collaborated with the Healthy Building Network in the United States and released a white paper looking at this nexus between carbon and human health when we go to look at different materials. And they did a case study looking at different flooring materials and also gypsum drywall. And what are the drivers for embodied carbon and also human health. And when we look to specify better performing buildings from a carbon standpoint, we also need to think about, where are these materials manufactured? How are they impacting what we would call is kind of redline communities living close to manufacturing plants? Are they are they polluting the environment? Is it creating acid rain? What is the impact of manufacturing on communities? What's the impact of the materials on human health as we breathe in different substances? And so just being really mindful that it's not an kind of an either or situation, is that we can specify materials that are low carbon and that are better for us from a human health standpoint. I think it would be great if we could, pick up a carpet tile in, 10, 15 years time, and there'd be a label on the back that would tell us all of those attributes. So we know what to do with it from an end of life standpoint. So thank you.
Very nice idea. Dina, so one of the most perceived barriers in the uptake to net zero developments is the access to finance. As the business case for decarbonization is really increasing, also is the demand for more sustainable investments. So what are the actions that you believe are now required in order to unlock more climate finance potential into those sustainable developments?
Very good question. I think the question should be is what are the mechanisms to access that finance? So the money is there. I mean, wherever you go, there's subsidies, there's grants, there's different policies and procedures in every country now that says, if you build this way, if you do this, we're going to give you this in return. So the money's out there. On top of that, there's private investors who are saying, we see the value of sustainable projects and we want to be part of it. Again, because the investment process is now looking at this in a more holistic manner and seeing that even residents would want to be in a more sustainable space or a space that has better well-being for them and their families, or even or their employees, or even the manufacturing entities are looking at better manufacturing facilities for their organization. So I think the question should be, how do we unlock that power of financing? Be it a small business, or be it a large business, or be it a real estate developer. And what we're finding is that disjointed, there's no one size fits all. And I think some of the conversations that we've been having here at COP are about that. How do you standardize the unlocking process? And again, there's so many pledges being made right now. We pledge, 1 point something billion and this and that. But then how do you get to that? And then you have innovators, you have technologies that really, really will drive change, and they don't know how to get to that money. So the mechanisms have to come from somewhere, and the mechanisms have to come from countries, but they also have to, I personally believe, have to be in a way standardized to make it easy on unlocking, especially for the global south. There's been a lot of pledges, for example, for a climate adaptation for small island states. There's been a lot of talk about mitigation plans and adaptation plans for everything from small villages to big cities. But unlocking that, and how do you go about bringing that and taking that down to the companies and organizations that are not only looking to innovate, but are looking to grow and collaborate with, let's say, the global south or the small island states. So I think there needs to be a standardized process, and I think we're seeing a lot of that right now. And I wouldn't be surprised if in the next few weeks we see a lot of this is how it's going to work. And I think the second thing is countries themselves have to start taking into account that standardization process. So we pledged a lot. We've gone out and said this much and this much and this much. So the money is there. It's the mechanism that we need to work on. That's my answer.
Great. Adam, what are your thoughts on this?
I think from a buildings finance perspective, what we see is quite a lot of money going towards green retrofit projects in particular. And one of the challenges that we see in that area is trying to understand what is good and what is good enough. And how do we get the balance between operational energy use, carbon, and embodied carbon. And I think trying to balance those three aspects, which don't always point in the same direction, is a real challenge for financiers to be able to say, actually, I'm putting this money and I know that I'm having a defined outcome. I know that the green bonds and climate bonds initiatives were quite reliant on certification and standards as a way of demonstrating compliance with the bond criteria to say it's a LEED rating, it's a BREEAM rating, something of that sort. And I think certainly what we see is that those certifications don't always translate into performance in use and practice. So moving towards a much more operational based set of criteria, but setting those in a way that don't compel people to do things that would be adverse from a climate perspective. So we see situations where a building is pretty good. It could be a lot better, but it could be better through management. But actually, in order to hit a externally imposed benchmark, there's consideration of changing the windows, recladding the building, replacing all of the plant. And actually, is that the right thing to do from a climate perspective? It's an open discussion. I think there's a lot of complexity there that we see, and we're up very close to it. And from a finances perspective, I can imagine that causes them quite a lot of complications.
Did you want to add anything?
Yeah, perhaps I'd just add, I think what we're also seeing in the marketplace is that there's a rise of private sector, public or publicly funded companies making ESG commitments. And so through those commitments, organizations are very much interested in tracking their greenhouse gas emissions and then being responsible for them, and whether that's through offsets. And so I think there is another financing mechanism available to us as we look at building retrofits or as we help clients build new assets, is actually we're reducing their carbon liability. We're reducing their carbon costs. We work for many academic clients in Canada who often have provincial requirements to offset their emissions. And so if we can actually help them design better buildings, reduce that carbon profile, we're helping reduce their operational costs right from the get-go. So I think while there's other funding mechanisms, sometimes there's funding mechanisms right within your client's hands that we need to kind of tap into and kind of bring to the forefront as part of the design discussions, because sometimes the operational budgets are divorced from the capital budgets for projects that we're working on. And so how do we bring those two budgets together right from the get-go of when we're retrofitting a building or when we're designing something new for a client?
Thank you. The fundamental issue for me is green finance and brown finance are nearly the exact same. There's no carrot for the green finance. The gap isn't big enough. So we're not there yet. And why we hear about green financing all the time, but for me, it's a bit of greenwashing as well. Because if you look at the numbers, you're not getting a lot more for building that green building than you would for a standard building. And that needs to change.
Dina, what are your thoughts on that last point that Louise has made?
I agree. I mean, at the end of the day, yes, green finance is there. What I'm talking about is incentives and all of these other things and grants and everything like that. But when you come down to green finance, as you said, we have to be realistic. But because of this being part of a let's say, bigger supply chain, I think you were mentioning, yes, our clients also want to measure their ESG. So then you have that incentive. They need to measure their carbon emissions impact, and they need to measure they need to have an ESG strategy, and they need to be able to meet that ESG strategy. So in a way, sometimes it's not even the financial incentive, and let's be honest, because that's not always the case. It's the fact that they have to do it. And that then creates more incentives to do better, and then it takes it from there. But we do have to be realistic about the fact that we are at the cusp, but we will be seeing more benefits as there are economies of scale, as there are more innovations that are coming, as there are more efficiencies. However, this is just the beginning, and we have to be realistic about that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can you hear me? What's the cost of not doing it is probably the bigger cost. What's going to happen in 10 years when we haven't aligned our assets? What is that going to cost us at the end of the day? That's what we should be focused on.
Adam?
I'll try and come in on that one, because we did exactly that exercise for the Climate Change Committee in the UK to look at what would be the cost of trying to retrofit new homes to a higher performance standard if we continued building at the existing standards that we've had in England since 2013. And the costs of achieving these higher performance standards were in the order of 2 to 3% additional cost on the previous standard. But if we were to try and do that via, and that's maybe say £5,000 or £6,000 per home. If we were to try and do that via retrofit, we'd be looking at 30, 40 plus £1,000 per home. So if you know you need to get there at some point, if it's not done during the first build, you're really stocking up a huge amount of cost for yourself in the future. So it's imperative, if you know you want to get there, then do it from the outset.
And what about the existing assets that are already there? Is that a burden for us, or is there like opportunities that you could think of, or that would help us?
I mean, there's certainly they're a great stock of assets. In as much as if we take the view of we need to knock all of our existing buildings down to build zero carbon buildings, we'll be in a really big mess because there's so much carbon tied up in those buildings and involved in building new ones. So we have to try and make the best of those. And I think if you can really understand how they're performing and how they're using energy and bring to bear the right systems, then you can make a massive improvement, not necessarily to the standard of a new building, but working within the current fabric, you can make a massive improvement and then target the interventions in the right areas so that you get the maximum return and achieve the right balance between operational energy and carbon and embodied carbon. You don't want to save 100 tons of carbon by expending 2,000 tons of carbon in the fabric. So we need to keep both in mind.
Noah, now over to you. So my question is, so how can the buildings that we're speaking of play a role in empowering renewable storage? And more generally, thinking of buildings as participants in the grid, in this decarbonization evolution that we're speaking of?
Yeah, I think this is such an important topic, and I think it dovetails really well with what was actually just discussed right now. Buildings can play such a powerful role, commercial buildings, your own home, and existing buildings too, which again is so critical because there's so much more existing buildings, and we can't and won't tear down every building to make a new one. And where I think this play comes in is the notion that the time electricity is given taken from the grid has wildly different impacts on emissions. You can easily double the emission savings and move a building from being a net emitter to a net offsetter simply by changing the time electricity is given taken from the grid. So we've come up with a fun term for this. We like to call it carbitrage. It's a combination of carbon plus arbitrage. The idea there being leveraging the change of time that you're using electricity to arbitrage better carbon and cost outcome. And just to give a little example of this, in California, for example, buildings can very easily be net zero electric, meaning that they generate an amount of electricity over the year equal to how much they consume over the year, but still be 35% a net emitter, because generally when they're generating electricity, the grid is pretty clean and doesn't need much help. So you're preventing a clean power plant from emitting. And then later at night, when they're using an equal amount of electricity to what they generated during the day, or if it's during 4 to 9 p.m. when the panels have set, the grid does need help. And that additional electricity you're using is actually a dirtier power plant. So if you can flip that around and have storage, power storage of buildings, you can save your very valuable resource. You can harvest the energy you've generated from your solar panels and wait to give it to the grid, or reduce your own consumption from the grid when it would really help, those times when the grid is very dirty. And in doing so, that same building that could be 35% net emitter can move to a 35% net offsetter. And I think that ability to offset is so key. And this can be done at people's homes. This can be done for existing homes. This can be done for new buildings, existing buildings of all types. And it's just this notion of how can we change when electricity is used or given to be a helpful participant in the grid. And just to top it all off, you can even act fully as just distributed renewable storage. When you're on the grid, a battery is just storing power to be given back when it's most helpful. You can do the same here. You can take power from the grid to help the grid and give power back to the grid to help the grid later, even without solar panels. So it's just this idea that how can you give someone a tangible tool, something they can physically point to and physically understand, that's having a good carbon outcome? And to the points being made here, it's so critical to balance the operational carbon savings with the embodied carbon savings. You don't want to put a Mount Everest worth of solar panels and batteries to save a watt, but just having that holistic lens can really unpack very compelling outcomes. And then the last part with this is we want to make sure we're building the infrastructure, again, to empower a flexible future, a good future. The notion with the storage is, it may change over time about when you want to shift, but this battery or the storage is a tool that can adapt so that you can change when that time should shift. So it's just this giving us these tools for success.
Yeah, go ahead, Adam. Thank you, Noel.
I just wanted to add to that, in that we're seeing new businesses starting up in the UK which have exactly that model, and they take a price arbitrage as well as the carbon, and provide households at a community level with photovoltaics and battery storage, and then they manage the use of the battery and the photovoltaics and the grid in a way that detaches them from peak electricity, dirty electricity, and peak cost. And from managing that process on their behalf, they take a percentage which covers the cost of the equipment, it covers their management costs, and the household get a dramatically reduced bill and a carbon-free energy supply. So it's a really exciting development, and we're seeing these new business models which really, I think, have an opportunity to help people crack some of these difficult conundrums about how do we use PV to give us power in the middle of the night.
Maybe I'll just add, so, as we connect to cleaner grids or look at this kind of shifting of loads, then it becomes even more important to look at the embodied carbon emissions of your buildings, especially for a new building stock moving forward. So we're currently in the construction administration phase for a new academic building at the University of British Columbia, and this new health sciences complex will connect to a low carbon district energy system on campus. And so when we looked at the whole life carbon emissions for this building, given the cleanliness of the grid that it was connecting to, the embodied carbon emissions then started to represent 75% of the whole life carbon emissions. And so, depending on your grid makeup, the carbon intensity of your grid, you really need to study how you're going to prioritize your actions. And so, conversely, working on a project in the Calgary market sector, much dirtier grid in Alberta, in Canada, we experienced an inverse relationship where the operational emissions were probably 75% based on for that program that we were looking to design for, versus the embodied carbon. And so kind of understanding the grid intensity is a really important piece of solving this problem as we look at the built environment.
Agreed. So my last question, and that's to everyone. So COP27 has been ongoing for 3-4 days, a bit more, a bit less. And then we have one more week to go, and we've been hearing about all of those pledges. Where do you see us going with this? And what's the last thing that you want to state closing off this panel? Do you want to go?
Sure. So this COP is all about implementation, and so we've heard over the course of today about what are immediate actionable items, and I think for the clients that we work with, it's about maybe there's two things. If you're designing new buildings, how do you ensure that your buildings are electrified? You're not connecting to any fossil fuel sources of energy. That's a really big win. And then if we're looking at building retrofits, how do we decarbonize the existing building stock? Because that is a big piece of the puzzle we need to tackle as part of this climate agenda.
Thank you, Kathy. Adam?
I suppose for me, I think the term I've heard most today is implementation, and I think it's something that is often perceived to be some huge initiative, huge endeavor. What we need is 100 million square foot of PV or whatever it may be. From my perspective, what we have is we have millions of opportunities in all the buildings that we occupy every day. There are lots of things we can do ourselves or as asset managers we can do, but often we have loads of opportunities to intervene in those buildings, whether it's small things like we're going to change the lighting system, or we're going to recommission the BMS, or we're going to replace the boiler and put heat pumps in. Lots and lots of these incremental things are what's needed. And it's a question of making sure every time an opportunity arises, because they arise pretty much once a year, once every couple of years in most buildings, to do something, that we don't lose that opportunity. We don't think, actually, no, we're saving it all up for the big refurbishment. Actually, we just keep chipping away, and it will make a big difference and add up very, very quickly if we do it across the whole range of buildings that we have, because the technologies are there and they'll pay back very quickly, but we just need to keep implementing them.
You turned it off.
There's been a lot of narratives, but I felt a lot of them were quite siloed out in the blue zone today, and there's a lot of barriers brought up. Where's the finance? Where's the legislation? Where's the innovation? But whether we like it or not, we're on this journey, and if you're not on it, you're going to be left with a distressed asset that your investors will lose money on. You will be left with catastrophe as an investor, and you'll be left behind. So like Adam said, we need to start the journey. It's slow. There is return on that investment, and we need to share information, to share innovation. We should be transparent about what can be done now, and all get on that journey together. Don't wait for the legislation. Don't wait for the finance.
Totally agree. Yet again, yes, but I think the transparency part is very important, because we can implement and we can do all of these things, but we can't silo it. You have to be able to share knowledge, to share data, and you have to be okay with that, the good and the bad. And I think, going back to reporting, going back to new innovations whereby you can put out the data and have it open source to everybody. There's nothing wrong with that. You're not losing by doing that. You're actually gaining trust by doing that. In the region that I'm in the Middle East, this is a new concept. When we started reporting at Expo and putting everything out there, it was unheard of. We're putting all the numbers out there and they're verified, and that's going to be a problem. We saw the exact opposite. We saw that there was more trust in what we were doing. And I think as we move from COP27 to COP28, I think that those silos, as you were saying, need to be broken. But I also think there needs to be more transparency in what we've done right and what we've done wrong and the learnings from it. That's
Noah, are you still with us?
I am. Can you all still hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So again, going last, all the good points are usually already said. The only one I would like to add to is this notion of now is the time. This notion of not waiting for more legislation or waiting for more amazing technology to be developed before it might be appropriate to take action. We have the tools today. We have good tools today, and we need to take action today. And I think just having that mindset as citizens in the world and in our community is super helpful and also can be super empowering. And that notion of sharing our information, sharing our ideas, sharing our wins, sharing our losses as well, to arrive at those ideas that work, I think is so vital and exciting. And I think the only other thing I would add is maybe it's the community I'm in, but I think as humans, as people, we like gadgets, and often a gadget can be a way to overly simplify a problem or ignore a problem. But when there is a way to give something tangible, a gadget that someone can latch onto, that's a good thing, it's doing a good thing, then others can want that gadget. We're kind of a copycat species, and I think the idea of commoditizing some of these big wins, these big moves, in a way that doesn't actually undervalue or miss the situation can be a way to have a rapid scale up, which we all need. So just these notions of ideas that can repeat while not ignoring their context, I think can have a really big play in getting us on the right track and staying on the right track.
Excellent. Now I'll turn it over to our audience for any questions that you might have for our panelists.
We mentioned a lot about green finance and green economy, and I think we need to think how we can recover some of the costs incurred, because green finance is that, but unless we have the measures in place for the stakeholders to recover part of the cost, there, to provide incentives, sort of speak. So do you think this is already can be done simply, or is it a difficult thing,
Well, I think our clients can recover the costs through operational savings. So if we design better performing buildings, it will help them over their 50, 75-year lifespan in terms of operational savings from their utility bills. So I think there is a business case to be made. The other thing that I would advocate for is the clients that we work for who set a very strong vision right from the outset, that have a climate action goal or a carbon reduction goal right from the outset. It's one of their core project design drivers. It facilitates us to deliver upon that goal. It doesn't get value engineered out, because every single hard conversation that takes place has to be vetted against the design quality, the carbon performance of that building, whether it's meeting like a campus's objectives for a gateway experience. And so establishing strong goals from the outset that are perhaps KPIs, key performance indicators, that a contractor has to be evaluated against, really ensures that things don't get value engineered out when the tough gets going, and we have to talk about budget, we have to talk about schedule, and delivery time. So kind of veered off from your question there a little bit, but I do think, strong goal setting is part of the ability to deliver on budget.
Great. Thank you very much. You said something earlier about, I think it was spending 100 kilos to saving 100 kilos by spending 2,000, right? I love that. I'm going to steal it, by the way. I really like this concept of carbon budget. So just as you were, saying that, Kathy, I think one of the ways that we're finding that people are having those difficult conversations around the cost is by saying, actually, you can't afford that from a budget perspective if you're valuing carbon in the same way as you would a financial budget. So I wonder if that's what you're finding in terms of an approach with clients and if they're being responsive to that?
Yes, yeah, we do, and I think there's two ways of looking at the carbon budget. One is to monetize the carbon, and we often use the in the UK we'll use the government's value that they put on a ton of carbon, which at the moment is around £240 per ton, and it's going up to sort of 350 odd pounds per ton in the next decade or so. So that's quite a considerable additional weight to put on the balance of energy reduction measures, because it really helps demonstrate that you've got to pay back yourself. You've got this wider external benefit that you're delivering. We find that showing that over a period against an alternative option, where you just carry on as business as usual, really makes a compelling case. Actually, particularly for public bodies, as a public body, you are saving UK the equivalent of, let's say, 10, 15 million pounds by adopting this measure in comparison to continuing on your current trajectory. So those sorts of things are quite powerful. The other way that we look at budgets is to say between now and 2050, you have got so many tons of carbon you can emit to stay within the science-based target that you have set yourself. And when you put it in that context, suddenly that really drives decision making very rapidly. And what I think is interesting with that is that you need to be able to not get carried away, not try and jump to the best option immediately. Not in every instance, but there's a temptation to say, well, okay, I need to electrify my heating because that's going to give me the biggest carbon saving, and I've only got so many tons I can emit, and if I delay it for another year, then that's another year of my budget gone. If you start to make sort of big sweeping changes in the way your building operates before you have taken the time to understand it, you can really mess it up quite badly, and you end up with a situation where you can't keep it warm, you can't keep it cool, it's costing you a fortune, etc. So doing it in a measured way, but doing it as quickly as you possibly can is key, and those budgets really do help to focus minds on it, definitely.
And just as a follow-up, you mentioned earlier about the cost of solar panels, and presumably that's an equivalent conversation or discussion that comes into deciding if you're going to install that particular heat pump technology or that particular type of glazing.
Yeah.
And are you finding that it helps to, I mean, I guess it would depend on the particular type of client, but is it like this building can't afford that from a carbon budget point of view or a cost point of view now, but if we do this today and then it could be upgraded in like 2 or 3 years. So it's more like a net zero ready strategy rather than pushing the boundaries of the financial budget today to reach the target, if actually you're expecting to see those exponential drops in the future on some of those other technologies.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely that possibility, but we would still, unless there's absolutely no way it can be accommodated, we still say do it initially. We did an interesting study where we compared a passive house home which had a gas boiler for hot water and residual heating with a home that was built to a much lower performance standard, probably 3 or 4 times higher heat loss than the passive house, but it had a heat pump. Over 60 years, it was 70% better in terms of the carbon emissions than the passive house with a gas boiler. So, and most of that was in the next sort of 15 years or so. So you're locking that in, that additional carbon in if you don't do it initially. If you have to, then definitely planning for it and making sure you've got space allocated on your roof, or you've got, for external units and things like that is really key, because those can be blockers if you haven't got that space allocated. But the other thing that we often see is is to be smart about where you spend your money. So it's often the case, like historically, where trying to get to net zero, people would say, right, well, we need a heat pump, we need solar panels, we need solar hot water system, we need underfloor heating system, we need this, we need that. And you end up with this massive pile of technologies in one building. And actually, if you say, well, we're going to have a really good fabric, we'll take out most of the heating system, we'll have a ventilation system that does what little heating we have left, so we can strip out all of that cost from the heating system. We've designed it so we don't need any cooling. We don't need that much hot water because we've got an efficient heat pump generating hot water from the photovoltaics. You've got rid of 5 technologies from your building. You've brought your cost back down to budget, and you've still got all the energy and carbon benefits. So it's about where you spend your money as well as how much.
To be smart about where you spend your energy and be smart about where you spend your carbon.
Exactly.
There was 2 other questions.
Yeah.
So given the push for decarbonization and sustainable design, there are now a few projects that utilize 3D printing in their construction phase. Could 3D printing be a sustainable and cost-effective alternative for mass housing projects in the future?
Absolutely. This is all you're going to remember me for. Absolutely. We're seeing a huge amount of 3D printing now in Saudi Arabia. There was a few test models done, I think one for Expo. There's a net zero 3D print down in Dubai at Museum of the Future. That's net zero. So there's a huge reduction in carbon on 3D printing. They're trying to get into bigger mass and more modular inside the systems. But 100%, that's the way things are going for sure.
Thank you.
Hi. So given that the building obviously is designed for to be operated in a certain scenario, but given that the user, we don't know how they actually would interact with the building. So there's so much you can actually control in terms of passive operation of the building, but how do we ensure having that the single user or the single tenant or the person who's at the building being an active contributor to reducing the emission of the building itself?
Can I have a go first? My mic's on, so I don't. We just done a test with the Marriott where they increased all of their temperatures by 1 degree for a week. All the staff were panicking that it wouldn't work. So the manager of the hotel said, let's give it a week. No matter what complaints, we keep it at the temperature and we just record the complaints. There wasn't one customer complaint. All the complaints were from staff. And he saved 20% on his energy in 1 week by just adjusting the thermostat by 1 degree. So habit and occupancy usage is a huge factor in how we use our carbon for sure. Sorry, Adam. Press the button.
Maybe I'll just add to that occupant behavior change is a huge part of this conversation, is that we do have to educate our occupants about the buildings that we design or retrofit. We've talked with many academic clients moving into buildings about departmental challenges, that they have a carbon budget, and to see who can actually operate within their carbon budget, or they would get kind of financially taxed. I think one of the big challenges that we sometimes have is we design a core and shell building. We don't always know who the end user is. We don't know what the plug loads are. Somebody could move into a health sciences building and install or plug in 10 MRI units. That could skew our whole energy budget. So, thinking about tenant guidelines and putting parameters around budgets for energy use, budgets for carbon, will be a really important factor moving forward so that the occupant behavior can match how the building was designed.
And here's the importance of the digital twin in the sense of really validating all of the use cases here towards the carbon targets and the budgets that you've set as well. Yeah, there was another question.
First, thank you for this informative session and for sharing your valuable ideas. My question is, do you think that what is really needed is a comprehensive framework that's capable of collecting ideas and rearranging those ideas to come up with an action plan or a responsibility matrix to get all parties involved and facilitate decision making throughout the life cycle of a building? Plus, how do you think, or in your opinion, how can we achieve or generate this framework?
So again, speaking just for the UK, and we've just literally in the last week started an initiative to develop a certified performance standard for net zero buildings that takes into account a lot of the points that we've been discussing today about what level of energy efficiency is needed, what's the amount of on-site generation that's credible for different types of buildings, and how do you go about verifying the performance in use, and how do you then certify and accredit that building to be performing at that standard. So it is something that is happening, but it's I think the questions that we're asking are really good questions, but they haven't often been answered very, very well in the past. And there's a real paucity of good data on how buildings perform. So trying to determine what is good practice for any given type of building we're still a little bit away from what that is. So it'll be a work in progress, but the work has certainly started on trying to bring that all together in one place.
So from the Middle East perspective, I think we are seeing those frameworks coming. Again, the market is still not as mature, but what we are seeing is for example, the UAE Green Building Council that's now taking what you've done and trying to adapt it and adopt it for the region. So there are frameworks that are coming, and I personally believe the fact that COP27 is in the region, COP28 is in the region, is going to accelerate those frameworks to come to life. And this region is a very young region. So we're building for a younger generation that's actually more aware than definitely my generation. So they want to be in a place where there is no negative, let's say, environmental impact or social impact. And I think as we move through the next few years, we're going to see that transformation go really fast.
Well, thank you, Ever. Do we have time for one more question?
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Okay, actually, I'm talking about the possible solution could be simply raising the awareness of all involved parties. Once we can focus our effort to involve more stakeholders and raise their awareness, people are the cause for this problem, our environmental problem, and also the possible solution could come from them. Everyone, once he has the awareness about the sustainability issue and the environmental problem, he will put his small input to share how to solve this problem. So at the end, it's like the snowball, the snow, all of ice, okay, snow of ice, that will be grown, and the solution will came back from the people. They will understand, once they have the awareness, they will understand the financial impact, so they will understand the payback period and choose the right material for the suitable solution. Their health, the human health will be improved by choosing the low VOC materials and understanding the total embodied energy, so they will select the proper material for the proper use. The codes and legislation could be decision makers will do more effort to improve the codes and legislation once the involvement and awareness are raised. I remember 15 years ago when we were talking about in Egypt here about the rating systems and LEED, people don't understand it. Now we have hundreds of engineers and architects are already certified. I think we are can just put a small effort to increase the involve more people and raise their awareness. And once this could be after maybe 5 years, 10 years, the situation will be totally different from now. Is it a proper solution?
Can I respond to that one? If you all can hear me?
Go ahead, Noah.
Yeah, that's such a great point, and we found that the more stakeholders you can involve, the more sustainable solutions make sense. Taken to the extreme, it's good for the planet. And so the other part that I think is so important is if we want these ideas to stick, they need to be understood. If we want buildings to be operated the way that we meant, they need to be understood by those who would be there. And so the ownership of those ideas, the contribution of those ideas goes so far to the success of these outcomes. We don't accomplish anything by getting a building in a magazine. We accomplish something by the outcomes. And the more that people are involved and the more sense of responsibility and ownership they have, the better chance there is at those outcomes. So I think that perspective is a great point, and thank you so much for elevating it.
want to add, Kathy, to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, maybe just linking back to the World Green Building Council's Net Zero Carbon Buildings program, or the commitment that many of our organizations have signed on to. I think it's probably the last action item within that commitment that says, as a signatory, you actually have to advocate. Perkins and Will is the second largest global design firm, and so we have a voice. You know, we work with millions of clients, we deliver millions of square feet around the world, and so we can actually advocate through the delivery of our buildings, showing the possibility of offering our clients something new. We can advocate to government organizations, local policymakers who are bringing forward building regulations, and actually talk to them about opportunities, but also challenges in terms of what our clients are facing and how to kind of bring about that change. So I think the education part is really important of all the stakeholders, but then also taking those lessons learned and advocating for change. And I think that's why we're all here today.
Thank you, Kathy. So if no one has anything to add, yes.
For brownfield projects, does it mandate a 50% cut in embodied carbons, or will that be in 2050? Because we had some discussion, it was a bit confusing in the standard. Yes, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no, so what we say in the kind of mainstream vision for all projects is 40% reduction in embodied carbon from 2030. Yeah, 40% reduction. There's some references that say at least 40% and are pushing up higher, because there was a report from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and Arab that found that you can already achieve a 40% reduction today, at least a 40%. So some targets are a little bit higher depending on the country. But as a total, as a sector, by total, we say at least 40%, and we should be pushing higher. And the point about offsets that Noah made earlier is right. You know, if you can achieve higher, you should go higher. What we then say is, you know, we don't pat ourselves on the back for 40% because you've still emitted 60%, right? We have to do something about what's left. So 40% isn't the target. We should be trying to achieve as high as possible reductions. Yeah. So the embodied carbon targets are for new buildings. Yeah. Embodied carbon targets will be for new projects, because the embodied carbon it's already happened. Yeah. So, but you can, I mean, you'll all know that you can make some impacts on reducing the embodied carbon if you're retrofitting or doing a major renovation of an existing building. Then yes, it would apply then. But usually, if the frame has already happened, the embodied carbon's already happened as well. Yeah. Nice.
I think we ran over time a bit. Thank you for everyone here. Thank you, Noah, for joining in early in the morning on the West Coast. That's really appreciated. A lot of insight from your side. Thank you again.
My
Thank
pleasure.
you for
Thank you.
audience and your very valuable question. Take care, Noah. Thank you. And thank you for our panelists. Thank you for being here today and for the very informative points that you've made to all of us. Thanks again, and we'll see you soon.